Hi everybody, Professor Kauser here for another video lecture for the 6th century course at Plymouth State University. We've finished up Unit 1 talking about the Byzantine Empire, and we're now moving on into Unit 2 where we're going to move westwards across the Mediterranean Sea a bit and start looking at Italy, mainly Ostrogothic Italy, and then the arrival of the Lombards, and we'll deal a bit with the Italian Church, particularly the Pope, in between for a little bit. I want to start off, now that we're starting to think about barbarian kingdoms and the Ostrogoths in particular, and take a moment to think about what it really means to have these barbarian groups where they are, and what exactly we mean when we identify such a group. You will recall from the earlier video lecture on the breakup of the Western Empire in the 5th century that we used as kind of a preface to thinking about our 6th century events, that the late empire had seen the immigration of a number of peoples from outside the empire that had come to settle on Roman soil, and that as the empire broke up, their leaders, their kings, tended to become the most powerful regional figures, and therefore sort of wound up holding the reins of power as the empire sort of disintegrated around them, which is what we're sort of starting with here as our beginning point. But we want to think a little bit about what the peoples themselves are, what constitutes one of these barbarian groups. They used to be called tribes. We tend to avoid that term now because it implies certain things about their structure and organization that may not necessarily apply. And so most often in the modern scholarship, you'll see these various groups referred to simply as groups or as peoples, sometimes as ethnicities, and there's some issue with what ethnicity means. There's been a lot of shift in historical scholarship when it comes to thinking about ethnicity in general, and particularly the ethnicities of the late Roman Empire and early medieval period, based on some things that have gone on in anthropology. A century or so ago, the opinion on this, the way this was approached, going back into the 19th century, the assumption was that an ethnic group, an ethnicity or a nation, was pretty much a consolidated fact. People felt membership in a group, it was identifiable, had definable boundaries, it had a definable language and culture. Everybody in it was descended from a common ancestor or interlinked with each other by marriage and by kinship, and so the ethnic group was sort of a stable, factual reality. It would have a history, of course, it would grow or decline, it would develop new things and sort of bring out new manifestations of its character as it went through its history. It might migrate about from place to place, but the group itself basically remained compact and intact and definable and not really changing in its essentials. Okay, that's the older kind of view of ethnicity. As the 20th century went on, though, anthropologists in particular came to really question that. They started noticing that ethnicity and the way that people identify themselves and label themselves and identify what group they belong to turns out to be a lot more fluid than that. You will get people who may have very different cultures or different languages, but nevertheless will identify as the same ethnicity. You will have people who will have a very similar culture and speak the same language, but will insist that they are different in ethnicity, even though it's really hard to tell what the criteria are by which they distinguish themselves. So the whole idea that ethnicity is a fact of nature that people just automatically have, that they inherit from their parents, and that carries on unchanging through the generations or as a group moves from place to place, turns out not really to be true. So after the Second World War or so, scholarship, particularly influenced by anthropological studies, shifted over to the view that predominates today, which is that ethnicity is what we call a situational construct. Okay? It's situational in that the decision to identify oneself or to identify somebody else as belonging to a particular ethnic label is a decision that is made according to the particular situation, right? People apply that label to themselves or to others when the situation motivates them to do so, when they find it to be somehow in their interests or appropriate for them to apply that label. It's not just a fact that goes around unchanging. There's a deliberate response to circumstances that cause people to identify a certain way. And it's a construct, simply meaning that it's not a fact which is inherited and unchangeable, but rather it is constructed by human activity, right? By human thought, by human language. People decide to construct ethnic identities, to assign certain characteristics to themselves, or claim certain characteristics for themselves, or attribute them to others, again, based on those situational requirements and motivations that they have as they're dealing with things. What that means in some cases is that a particular ethnic label, a term like goth, might persist from generation to generation, even over the course of centuries. It might be claimed claimed by or applied to groups of people who are living in very different places over the centuries. It might be Spain, it might be Italy, it might be the Balkans, it might be the steppes of the Ukraine. But what the term actually means can vary a lot from circumstance to circumstance, right? The Goths of the 3rd century Ukrainian steppe, that term doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as the Goths who are sacking the city of Rome in 410, or the Ostrogoths who are ruling Italy in the 6th century, or the Visigoths who are going to rule Spain into the 8th, right? They're all Goths in some sense. There's some sort of a label or an idea there that they're all laying claim to, or that other people are identifying them by, but what that actually means, what the criteria are, what the definition is of who is and is not a Goth, that can shift very considerably over time and over circumstances. So we've shifted over this idea of ethnicity as a social construct or a situational construct. And that's a very important idea to bear in mind for the rest of the course, really, because we're going to be looking at a number of different barbarian groups. We're going to have our Ostrogoths, you're going to have Burgundians, you're going to have Franks, you're going to have Angles and Saxons and Irish and so forth. And we want to think about, what exactly do those labels mean? What do they mean for us as historians applying them to people in the past? What did they mean to the people in the past themselves? And how did they shift? In some cases, actually, by the way, you can trace, give an ethnic label that'll actually disappear. It'll go out of use. People will stop identifying themselves by it, and it just vanishes for a generation or more. And then a generation or two or a century later, people start identifying themselves by it again, and it gets revived. And, an ethnicity that had seemingly gone extinct or vanished from history will suddenly reappear, and you'll have a new group using that label. So there's all sorts of things like there, just illustrating the fluidity and flexibility of things like ethnic labels. Okay, so bear that in mind. As we do think about barbarians and the Western Europe, the former territories of the Western Empire, and the peoples who are living there, one thing that would be valuable is to try and get ourselves into the heads of late Romans looking at these groups and looking at the territories that they live on. It may be helpful to remember that ancient Romans didn't really use maps very much, nothing that looked like modern maps. We will take, sort of modern cartographic surveys and, color the maps with boundaries and things to show what the Roman Empire looked like, but very few Romans had ever looked at anything of the kind, and what handful of maps do survive from the ancient world don't look anything like a modern one. They probably didn't have the same kind of visual sense of a map of the empire that we do. Rather, they would think more in terms of moving across a landscape. You're in a city, you cross a river, you come to a plain. As you move through the landscape, you encounter different people, and it's much more close to the ground, not the kind of view from space that we have when we look at a modern kind of a map. And the other thing is that we need to remember that as the Roman Empire grew, it very rapidly became and remained very multi-ethnic. Okay, at all times, there was always a sense that the empire embraced a great many peoples, and the Romans made a virtue of this. They prided themselves on their ability to not only conquer, but incorporate peoples of many different ethnicities, that they were all part of this, grand Roman enterprise. They would compare themselves favorably to the Greeks, who never really found a way to incorporate non-Greeks into their culture or into their cities, didn't grant them citizenship or anything. Romans, on the other hand, could build a civilization that could embrace the entire world. So the empire was always multi-ethnic. The Romans always looked out from Rome and sort of, saw a landscape filled with people of different ethnicities, all subject to Rome, ideally. And their ideology, going back to pagan times, even before the Christian Empire, was a variant on what we call parallel sovereignty. Okay, so their vision, their political vision of themselves in the world was based on this ideology that modern scholars call parallel sovereignty. Parallel sovereignty means that God or the gods, the divine pagan times, this would have been the gods collectively, um, have made their chosen people, in this case the Romans collectively, it's kind of a collective version of parallel sovereignty. The gods have chosen the Romans as rulers of the world, right? The gods rule the cosmos, the Romans rule the world, and that was very much the Roman vision of things, okay? That has some implications for how the Romans thought about and dealt with non-Roman peoples, okay? Peoples that they would call barbarians. The ideology meant that in terms of sovereignty, in terms of right to rule, the Romans were already sovereigns over the entirety of the earth. Okay, there was no part of the earth which was not justly Roman property. Had already been given to Romans and placed under their sovereignty. That was understood. So at the theoretical level, Rome is already the ruler of the universe because the gods have given Rome, ruler of the world, of the earth, because the gods had given Rome the rule of the earth. In practical terms, however, of course, there are many peoples out there who defy this authority that Rome has been given, who defy Roman sovereignty, and who might need to be taught a lesson, might need to be taught that the Romans are the supreme rulers of the world. And the Romans will do so when it is practical for them to do so, right? When they are able to, in practical terms, mount a military expedition to subjugate those people and extract submission from them and taxes from them and so forth. But if the peoples are too far away, if they are too poor for it to pay off the effort, if it would be too difficult or too expensive to mount such an expedition, then it could wait till a future time, right? So there's this distinction between Roman ideological theory, in which Rome is already the ruler of the entire world, and the practicalities where Romans understand that it may not be beneficial or practical or worthwhile to actually go out there and impose their actual jurisdiction on foreign peoples. So you get this kind of radiation of authority out from the center, where peoples who are in easy reach, close into Rome, around the Mediterranean Sea and so forth, are actually brought under Roman administration, organized into provinces, paying taxes, obeying Roman laws, Roman governors occupied by Roman soldiers and so forth. Then you're going to get a penumbra around the frontiers of peoples who are just a little bit beyond where it's practical to send the legions to actually impose direct Roman rule. In those areas, the Romans would still maintain the tone that they are the proper rulers of everybody, and therefore they would not engage in diplomacy with those frontier peoples on an equal footing, ever. Right? The diplomacy had to be conducted with the protocol being that Rome is a superior partner, the patron, and any people they're negotiating with or forming alliances with beyond the frontiers are the inferior partner, the patron, who would duly submit themselves to Rome's higher authority, even if they aren't being subjected to direct Roman administration. And then, of course, you would have a third ring of people still further out who are just too far away for it to be worth the effort at the current point in time, but maybe someday in the future, Rome will expand to the point of incorporating them as well. Okay, so sort of this three-ring zone where you've got all the peoples of the world who are within easy reach, who are under Roman administration, peoples who are maybe a little bit beyond that, but who nevertheless duly express their submission and their deference to Roman sovereignty and Roman rule over the world, and then peoples who are just too remote and that they're not really, necessarily dealing with, or not in any direct kind of a way. Okay. This is important to think about when we try to understand how Justinian's empire, or really the Eastern Empire before Justinian, rather, between, say, 476 and 530, it's a good 50 or 60 years there, right, or so, before Justinian takes the throne, from the time the last Western emperor had been deposed until Justinian begins his reign. That's almost 60 years. During that period, from the perspective of Constantinople, you have a ongoing Roman Empire, a Roman emperor at Constantinople. There are all these provinces out there which were under administration by Romans. There are still governors and counts. Taxes are still getting collected. Laws are still being enforced. The Eastern Emperor is not really directly overseeing that administration. Those areas are kind of running themselves. But the supreme authorities out there are kings of barbarian peoples who have settled on Roman soil with Roman permission under treaties and who will engage in friendly diplomatic relations most of the time, in which they will duly express their deference to the Roman emperor, who is the sole emperor in the world as far as they're concerned. They're not paying taxes to him. He's not sending governors out to them. They're appointing their own. They're running the local administrations locally. But as far as Roman ideology goes, that's not necessarily a problem, right? It's okay as long as the barbarians who are a little too far away to be worth our, administering directly, as long as they are adopting the proper protocols and acknowledging Roman supremacy. There's nothing really to be objected to in them, governing their territories independently, pretty much, right? So when Justinian does rule and decides to launch his invasion first of the Vandal kingdom and then later of the Ostrogoths in the 530s, it really is a shift from the outlook of the prior 50 or 60 years, right? Since the 470s, the assumption had been we still have a Roman Empire, it's still multi-ethnic, there's still lots of peoples out there, they're all expressing their proper deference to Rome, and there isn't really, a particular problem with all this. With Justinian, though, the attitude shifts. You start seeing more of a notion that the empire has lost those territories, that the lack of direct administration, the lack of governors appointed from Constantinople and garrisons sent out by the military authorities of Constantinople, this now does not constitute barbarian client peoples in a proper relationship to the empire. This now constitutes lands that have been taken away from the empire and that need to be recovered, right? That need to be restored. And so you get this kind of concept of reconquest. Very often when we look at Justinian's campaigns in northern Africa and Italy, we talk about them as wars of reconquest without even really thinking about, why reconquest? Why not just conquest? That's based on an assumption that these are lands that belonged to the Eastern Empire, that belonged to Constantinople, were supposed to, or had at one time been ruled by them, and are now being restored, being reconquered, brought back under their administration. In a sense, they never had been, right? Constantinople had always been an Eastern Roman capital, governing an Eastern Empire after the empire had been partitioned. There wasn't really that direct of a sense that the Western lands sort of ever had been under Constantinople's administration. They had gone their own way, but they had always been separate from Constantinople in some sense. So big shift, right, for Justinian saying, I'm sole Roman emperor, and therefore I am going to reimpose direct rule over these particular lands and launch military expeditions. Okay, so really need to recognize how significant and how new of a shift that is. Okay, so that's as far as the sort of Roman perspective on barbarian peoples living on Roman soil, right? For a long time, not seen as particularly objectionable. In many ways, these barbarian peoples, they're still receiving, between the 470s and 530s, they were still receiving honorary titles like consul and patrician and senator from the Roman court at Constantinople. They had been acknowledged as sort of officials of the empire in some sense, even though they didn't report directly and administratively to the emperor or his officers. They ruled over a population that thought of themselves as Romans, that continued using Roman law. They continued to think of themselves as being in this kind of a service in some way. So, just managing their things according to the treaties they had signed. So, you don't have the same perspective that we often assume in hindsight that the Roman Empire was gone. Very few writings of the time even register any acknowledgement that the empire has somehow gone away. It's just things are going on year to year with the new events each year developing as they develop. Okay, so that's all significant to bear in mind from the Roman perspective. It's very much an era that's in flux that way. Okay, what about these groups themselves, these barbarians, these Ostrogoths, Visigoths, Franks, Burgundians, Alans, Lombards, Vandals, Angles, and Saxons, and all the other kinds of groups that are around you? What are they? Let's go back to the term ethnicity. What are they, and how are they constituted, and how do we think about the nature of them? Here we're dealing mainly with peoples who are coming from northern Europe beyond the old Roman frontiers along the Rhine and Danube River, loosely speaking from lands that the Romans called Germania. Was not a united nation of Germany, so it's a little bit inaccurate to call them Germans, although they are speaking interrelated languages, so we often refer to them as Germanic peoples, and they have a lot of shared components in their culture, as far as we can tell, coming as Germanic peoples, barbarian peoples, coming into the empire. A few things that are apparent about these groups. One is that a lot of them are relatively new in formation in the later Roman Empire. If you read the Roman writer Tacitus, who is writing around the year 100, in the sort of heyday of the empire, he wrote a book called Germania, the sort of description of the lands of the barbarians beyond the frontier. And in the Germania, Tacitus listed, dozens of individual groups. I think close to 100 of them, actually. Lots and lots and lots of small barbarian groups out there beyond the frontiers. By the time you get to the 4th century or so, and you start seeing how many named groups can you identify beyond the frontiers there, Tacitus's 50 or 100 groups have been boiled down to maybe 15 or 20 at most. Okay, a much, much smaller collection of peoples. It's not that a bunch of groups had gone extinct, it's rather that what used to be a large number of small groups have formed confederations and come together into a smaller number of larger groups, right? People sort of united together. Where you used to have 4 or 5 small communities, you'll now have one big one. And the names of some of the new larger groups that you see, these new confederations forming in Germania, in some ways kind of reflect awareness of this, or reflect the novelty in some ways. Some groups are very old. The name of Goth goes back quite a ways. But other groups, for example, in the southwest corner, very close to the Roman frontiers, you get a group called the Alemanni. In French, Alemannia still comes from this particular Germanic confederation. And Alemanni, as you might guess from the sound of it, just means all men, right? Sort of all the people, everybody together. And that kind of expresses that this is a coalition of many different groups came together and coalesced. You no longer have Cherusci and Chauci and Bructeri and so forth. You've got this, one big group, the Alemanni. Same thing with the Franks further north along the Roman frontier. The word Frank as an ethnic term is related to the modern English word frank. If you speak frankly with somebody, you're being bold with them. You're not being shy. You're not being afraid of what they're going to think. You're speaking your mind bravely and forthrightly and boldly. And that's what Frank means. These are the bold people, the brave people, sort of expresses an idea they're a warrior people. Again, kind of a name that reveals this is not an ancient group that goes back time out of mind. It's a relatively new confederation of people sort of forming a warrior alliance and identifying themselves by, we're the people who are all brave and bold here. So new confederations coming together, and probably, again, some of the older names like Goth and the Suebi continuing to be used, but, probably a lot of older, smaller groups getting folded into, a bigger group with those. So the composition is shifting quite a lot. The other thing one notices when one looks at the sources describing these groups moving around to some of their activities is very often you will have a lot of surviving group identities incorporated into the larger group. So, for example, you'll have a king of the Ostrogoths, and you'll be told the Ostrogoths migrated here or fought a war here or something like that. And then when someone describes the Ostrogothic army or the Ostrogothic settlers or something, you'll find a whole lot of people in there who are not Ostrogoths. You'll find people named as Alans who are not even Germanic. You'll have Huns who are also not Germanic. You'll have Lombards and Gepids and Heruli and all sorts of other smaller groups who seem to have sort of been folded into, this larger Ostrogothic thing. So when we talk about the Ostrogothic kingdom or the Ostrogothic army or the Ostrogothic people in any sense, we're not talking about a group that's ethnically homogeneous and everybody agrees they're an Ostrogoth, or at least not all in the same sense. Ostrogoth seems to be acting as a kind of an umbrella identity, which can fold in a lot of smaller groups, smaller identities becoming a member of it. And those smaller identities can also survive elsewhere. You've got Alans all over the place. There's Alans in the Frankish kingdom, there's Alans in the Ostrogothic kingdom, there's Alans in the Visigothic kingdom. The Alans seem to have been a group where different bands of them seem to have taken up with all kinds of other barbarian kings and followed them around and fought for them and gotten land in their kingdoms. And it's just, you've got Alans everywhere. There's a whole bunch of them. Okay, so again, this sort of goes back to what I was saying about the shift in anthropology, this idea that an ethnic label like Frank or Ostrogoth actually covers a lot of diversity, a lot of fluidity with ethnic identity, where you'll have some people who, on the one hand, may identify as Gothic or Frankish or something because they're part of that kingdom or, serving that people. But when they're looked at in more detail, they may also sometimes distinguish themselves and identify themselves as, well, actually, I'm an Alan, or I'm a Swabe, or I'm a Lombard or something. So a lot of complexity and multi-ethnicity going on there. Okay. How exactly then these groups form and what holds them together has been the subject of enormous controversy among historians of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. Okay, this is a major topic. It's called the ethnogenesis controversy. Okay, ethnogenesis. Ethnic groups and their genesis, how they come to be created. Like I said, the older scholarship before World War II assumed that each ethnic group, each barbarian tribe, was a consolidated, defined, self-conscious reality. If you were a Goth, you were a Goth, you were a Goth, and as the Goths move around from place to place, they stay Goths, and being Goth always means the same thing. And this, group, this block just sort of moves from place to place, time to time, setting up different kingdoms or whatever, and there's, not very much problematic about that. After World War II, though, as I was saying, this concept starts being harder and harder to hold on to. It really seems less and less likely that we really are looking at such stable, consolidated groups just moving around. There was different efforts to try and figure out how to think about them on alternative terms. The leading, or at least a sort of starting point that a lot of the debate is centered around, ethnogenesis theory was developed at the University of Vienna by a scholar named Reinhard Venskus. Actually, not kind of at the University of Vienna, kind of at the Austrian Institute for Historical Research, the Österreichisches Institut für Geschichtsforschung, which is a separate research history institution at Vienna. So it's kind of related to the university there. Anyway, you have this Vienna school built around Reinhard Venskus, school of thought, not institution, and the Austrian Institute. Venskus's idea is that the actual population of a given ethnic group, of a given Germanic people, was extremely fluid. He recognized this and wanted to adapt to it. His idea was that if you looked out in barbarian Germany, what you had was not a bunch of, defined territories with a bunch of people who firmly belonged to one ethnic group or another. What you had was rather a very fluid area with very undefined identities where people could attach themselves or detach themselves from larger coalitions at will. Okay, very loose kind of society where people could come together in large bands if they wanted to, or separate out and go home and be more individual if they wanted to. So they could take on an identity or shed it as they saw fit. Okay, that's part of Venskus's idea. But the other part of that, though, is an idea called the Traditionskern. Okay, Traditionskern. I'll try and remember when we get together on Monday to spell this on the board for you, because I don't have a means to put it on the video here. But the Traditionskern, the kernel of tradition, or seed of tradition, okay, is the core of tradition. Venskus's other idea, along with the idea that the population of the Germanic barbarian lands was very fluid in its identities and didn't have any sort of permanent fixed identity for most people, but he held there are certain eminent families, bloodlines, dynasties, kin groups, who maintained a very strong family sense of identity, family sense of continuity, had high prestige, perhaps carried symbolic objects like a, allegedly magic sword or something like that, talismans, that kind of a thing. And which had a family story, a family myth, which would have traced their descent from the gods back once upon a time when they were all pagans. Okay, so sort of since there are certain key bloodlines out there among the Germanic peoples that have a certain mythology and ideology and symbolism attached to them. And these families would have the prestige and the charisma to potentially be able to attract followers, right, from the more amorphous mass of the population. If they were undertaking a raid, or if they were trying to, assemble a people for war or something like that, then their charisma, their reputation, their prestige could cause the sort of larger bodies of people to assemble around them, out of people of whatever different backgrounds from whatever different areas, out of the fluid society around them. So in Venskos's view, what we're looking at when we see barbarian migrations is not a fixed, stable group of people with a defined boundary that, all migrates around from place to place in a stable kind of a way, maintaining its identity intact as it goes. What you're seeing rather is a small traditionskern, a family, a lineage group, a bunch of interrelated people with a certain prestige, and a very fluid mass of followers who have pegged their fortunes to sort of, getting ahead or making their fortune based on their following that particular Traditionskern. They're sort of becoming Ostrogoths or becoming Franks or becoming Vandals or becoming whatever for the time being, hoping that it's going to lead them to, to plunder or to new land or to, some other great achievement that they'll be benefiting from. Okay, so that's the Venskos model, this Traditionskern model. Okay, so these traditions associated with kind of elite lineage groups in an otherwise very amorphous society, which can freely attach itself to or detach itself from these charismatic families, as circumstances call for. Okay. Venskos's ideas were carried forward and developed somewhat by Herwig Wolfram. And actually, you're going to be reading in a couple of weeks a chapter out of one of Wolfram's books, The Roman Empire and Its Germanic Peoples. Very significant its in there. The idea of these Germanic peoples are very closely tied to the Roman Empire. They're not just floating around out there totally independently. And actually, the first chapter you're reading for this Italian unit on Byzantium and its relations to the barbarian peoples, Walter Pohl is also Austrian, and he's actually also sort of third generation of this tradition at the Austrian Institute for Historical Research. So, Venskos, Wolfram, and then Pohl, there's a bit of a continuity there as you go along, this sort of Vienna school tradition in the historiography. Okay, Pohl, by the way, greatly moderates and is much less confident. Well, maybe confident isn't in the word, but he's much less doctrinaire about asserting a Traditionskern kind of a view. On the other hand, I said this was controversial, right? This is part of the big controversy. That's one side, Vienna school ethnogenesis. The other side is a party we could call the Romanists. They're often associated with the University of Toronto, but particularly with a guy named Walter Goffert, who's actually at Yale now, not Toronto, but he was at Toronto for a long time. And his students and sort of a circle of people associated with him. So it's Romanist school of historiography over against the Vienna ethnogenesis people. Goffert's criticism of the Vienna school is that he argues that when you look at the actual historical sources that all this ethnogenesis theory is built out of, they are all written by Romans, they are all written in Roman soil, they're all written in Latin, none of them are written in Germanic languages, they're all written in Latin for a Latin-speaking, Latin-reading audience, and they all conform to the norms and assumptions and stereotypes of Latin literature. Okay, we don't have, Goffert would argue, any kind of independent source which indicates, some sort of Germanic culture of Traditionskerns out there without reference to Rome and to Latin civilization. Okay, in Goffert's view, he takes a very different approach to interpreting these sources. In his view, what we see in these sources are rather as I say, Latin writers writing for a Latin audience, presenting Roman interpretations of what the barbarian peoples are all about and how they operate. Including, he would say, things like the origin myths, including things like the claims of descent from the gods. If you read, classical Greek mythology, all the heroes and kings are descended from gods. All the sort of migrations and the notion of where they come from. In Goffert's view, these are not reflections of barbarian culture coming into the Roman world from the forests of Germany. In Goffert's view, these are Roman creations that a Roman literate elite is using in order to impose its own interpretation on the barbarians out there, to sort of make sense of who they are and, and what they belong to. Okay, so very, very different interpretation, Romanist kind of interpretation. Goffert would basically say we need to be agnostic. We just don't know what Germanic culture was really like out there. We don't know how the Germanic peoples thought about their identity and their loyalties and their, ethnicity, because no source tells us that. All we have are sources from people in the Roman tradition saying what they thought of it. Okay, so Romanist, very strict challenge on the basis of the nature of the evidence to the Vienna school type of people. That's the controversy. So it will lead you to, depending on which point of view you consider more plausible, it'll lead you to read some of our sources, like Jordanus' Gaetica, which I need to get you all a copy of. I will post that up to the page as soon as I can, to read. Read it very differently. A guy like Jordanus and the Gaetica, this history of the Goths, written for the Ostrogoths, very interesting kind of a text here. On the one hand, Jordanus says that he himself is descended from Goths. He has Gothic heritage himself. Not clear if he's meaning, he's a whole-blooded Goth or whatever. But he is writing in Latin. He is writing for a Latin-speaking audience in the 6th century. He is at Constantinople. He's not out in Ostrogothic Italy or Visigothic Spain or someplace like that. He's writing for a Byzantine audience in a classical language, not in Gothic. The only text in Gothic we have is a translation of the Bible. Yeah, and claiming to be sort of, writing the history of the Goths here. On the other hand, another part of the puzzle for what Jordanus says is he claims to have based his history on an older history that we have now lost by Cassiodorus. Cassiodorus was a Roman senator from Italy who served as master of the offices under Theodoric the Great of the Ostrogoths, king of the Ostrogoths. So here you have a Roman working for an Ostrogoth, writing up an Ostrogothic history. Jordanus claims to have used Cassiodorus' history, and that raises all kinds of questions, a whole lot of can of worms. For one thing, how much of Cassiodorus did Jordanus actually use? Right? We don't know that. In some people's view, Jordanus basically, when we read his work, it is Cassiodorus' work, and they think Jordanus just maybe made a few edits and a couple of minor changes and additions, but basically we're reading Cassiodorus' history relatively straight. Other people think that maybe he only very loosely or only in very minor things borrowed a couple of things from Cassiodorus and has really made up a lot of this stuff himself, or, composed it in his own setting in Constantinople. That makes a big difference, right? Is this something, are we reading Gothic history as it was originally composed for the Gothic court, for the king of the Ostrogoths to read or listen to have read to him and agree that was his people's tradition? Or is this being composed entirely after the Gothic wars are over, the Ostrogothic kingdom has been destroyed, for an audience of Byzantines to sort of tell them what those Gothic people were all about, and now that they've been conquered, to sort of maybe by implication say something about how to, incorporate them back into the empire, or into the empire in the first place. It really changes things a lot. There's also a statement that Jordanus makes when he describes Cassiodorus' history, which has provoked a lot of debate. He says that Cassiodorus took Gothic history and made it Roman history. And we don't really know what he means by that. What does it mean that he took Gothic history and made it Roman history? The Romanist interpretation, right, for people like Goffert, would say that in a sense, Jordanus is referring to the content, right? That he's saying that what Cassiodorus achieved was to take the history of the Goths and incorporate it into Roman history so you could see the Goths belonging to Roman history, and of course drawing on Roman history a lot in order to construct a history of the Goths, right? Which would encourage the view that this is not reflecting any Germanic tradition from the Goths themselves. This is, a very Roman sensibility, way of creating what Gothic history is allegedly all about. On the other hand, the other another interpretation of that would be to say that Roman largely means Latin, largely refers to the literary form that Cassiodorus took the Goths, campfire stories or whatever oral traditions they had about themselves, and worked it up into sort of proper Latin literary language so that it would pass muster among civilized people. But the content of it, in the second view, would say, no, this is still reflecting, authentic Gothic oral tradition. The Cassiodorus is just writing up in a pleasant literary form. So, the debate rages on over those kinds of things. People analyze these sources closely and others from the era to try and distinguish, okay, what's the reality here? And obviously we're not going to settle this debate right now, but as you look at these texts and read them, do think about the implications going forward. Okay, so anyway, there's some of the cans of worms to open up the debate over ethnogenesis, the debate between the Romanists of the Toronto School and the ethnogenicists of the Vienna School, the issue of ethnicity altogether. Who are these people? What do they belong to? What do they mean? What does a source mean when it calls somebody an Ostrogoth or some other label? And what sort of weight does all that carry? Okay, thank you very much, guys, and I will see you on Monday.